Welcome boys and girls, Christine here with a discussion about the Chaos Dwarves in Total War Warhammer 3 Immortal Empires. On one hand, the Chaos Dwarves are one of the best races in the game, certainly one of the most uniquely designed races because of the various systems that they have, be it the various resource systems, the Hellforge, the Tower of Tsar, all of these kind of things that they do have available in their campaigns. The unit roster is also very solid, and you can make it incredibly deadly as well through various unit upgrades that you have available through the Hellforge. But there's also issues, and it's become very clear with things like AI buffs, with things like AI changes to try and make the long-term campaigns more viable, that the Chaos Dwarf balancing, not design, the balancing on a campaign side of things is lacking. If Race A can achieve a lot more and get higher tier settlements and a lot more unit variety and actually use that unit variety better than Race B, then Race B is just inherently worse. And that is the case of the Chaos Dwarfs. I think the problem with them is that for all the amazing design the developers put behind the Chaos Dwarves, they ultimately balance the race, like many other races in Warhammer 3 that came with the game. They balanced the race around the Realms of Chaos campaign, which is a campaign that can take over 100 turns, 160 turns. That was Creative Assembly's racial balancing done for ROC. It explains a number of things that never worked out even in Realms of Chaos, but it certainly doesn't work in Immortal Empires, because in Immortal Empires, due to the proximity of Legendary Lords to one another, you're always going to have a faster paced campaign. And I just finished playing a Dark Elf campaign, and I can tell you, compared to what the Chaos Dwarves can do, the Dark Elves are light years ahead. To be sure, the Dark Elves are one of the most ridiculous races in the game at the moment, but all the same, even races like Dwarves, Empire, Cafe, Greenskins, etc., they are capable of doing things better in their campaign. So let's go over what the issues are and what Creative Assembly could do to fix them. So first and foremost, we gotta talk about the unit caps and how they work. They're not especially great. The reason they're not especially great is because consider the situation you have with Warriors, Infernal Guard, Bull Centaur Renders, and War Machines, most of your artillery with the exception of Hell Cannons. You gain armaments playing the campaign. You have to go and build factories in order to get those armaments. There's some issues that crop up with that, but the idea is you get armaments, you unlock unit capacity. The problem that exists here is that with certain units, they become redundant or pointless even to recruit during the course of a campaign because they're using because they're sharing that unit cap with other units that are worth it more. An example, Chaos Dwarf Warriors with shields are always worth recruiting versus Chaos Dwarf Warriors with great weapons. Even if you're dealing with melee-centric factions, it's not really all that worth it to recruit Chaos Dwarf Warriors with great weapons. There's, like, regular Chaos Dwarf Warriors are capable of doing enough damage. Sure, they're lacking that armor piercing, but the durability loss and the fact that you don't have charge bonus versus large, for instance, is obviously going to cause issues in terms of the combat viability. It's a similar issue with Infernal Guard. For War Machines, well, let's just put it like this. Dreadquakes, Death Shriekers, and Magma Cannons are all inherently better than Skullcrackers and Iron Demons. And with Dreadquakes especially, Dreadquakes obviously are significantly better than all the other artillery options. With Bull Centaurs, they're variants of the same unit, but once you can get Bull Centaurs with great weapons, there's practically no reason to recruit the other versions. It is a better situation with Blunderbusses, Fireglaves, Fireborn, and Destroyers, as well as the various Flying Monsters, because they have their own individual unit capacity. So here's what I would say with respect to unit capacity. They should be separate. That would be a way to fix this. So you have a warrior with one hand and shield, and then you have a great weapon one. It should be cheaper to upgrade it, by default with respect to some of these, but you would have an incentive to increase individual unit capacities because obviously the escalating cost of certain units. I mean, you could always go for, just increasing breadcrate mortar capacity as opposed to and ignoring other artillery capacity, to be sure. But if you do get to a point of diminishing returns, and it just makes perfect sense to vary up your army. So as far as unit capacity systems go in Warhammer 3, this is a great system in the sense that it forces unit variety. It does absolutely work from that point of view, but it's still that kind of problem with certain units. So that's one of the first issues. And yes, it does create issues in terms of the kind of units you're going to recruit, right, during the course of a campaign. So that's the first problem to tackle when we're talking about them. But even that issue is a far smaller issue compared to the issues of settlements. So let's say I take Harakadrin over here, right? Let's just resolve that, whatever. Here are the options with provincial capitals. I can either make an outpost, a factory, a tower, but I can only get it as a tier 1 tower. I can sack the settlement, or I can raise it for a good amount of materials. Now, because of the way it works with raising settlements and occupying them at tier 1, I can always raise a settlement, get a good amount of money, and then occupy it as tier 1. The issue here is that unless you're spending influence, this tower will always be tier 1. And upgrading it is a fairly costly affair. And a long affair, too. There's two issues with respect to that. So issue number 1 is the cost in materials for towers. Issue number 2 is the long construction time that you inherently have for these provincial capital buildings. Other buildings in a Kasdorf campaign can be constructed fairly quickly, generally so, or you can get ways to construct them reasonably quickly, but then you have buildings that do require a lot of building time. One can argue, well, you have instant construction, so do Dark Elves. And Dark Elf construction times are normal. You don't have to deal with growth points, so you do get at increased construction time as a compromise. Okay, fair enough. But it still ends up feeling not all that great. Especially when you're considering the fact that in this situation, I actually have a way through the Tower of Tsar, I believe it is for the Tower of Tsar, to reduce construction time for all buildings by 1 turn for one of the seats. And also there's research that can improve construction times, for basic and advanced military buildings for the Industrial Revolution. But the costs over here are significant in materials. And that brings me to the bigger point, the cost of materials. If we're looking at the provincial capital, the capital itself can cost all the way up to 4,510 turns to get it to tier 5. That is a very long time. But it's not just that. While military buildings, advanced military buildings require armaments, basic one require gold, the problem you're also going to encounter is that garrison buildings, but especially like economic buildings or all kinds of buffs over here, require materials. And not a low amount of materials either. It is a very substantial amount. This makes the pacing of Kasdorf's campaign slower unless you're using a bunch of bullshit. But even with that kind of bullshit, you're just going to end up in a far more limited situation in your campaign, because you don't just have to get a bunch of materials, you also need to have a good amount of laborers in order to go for instant construction, and then you need to have a good amount of armaments to be able to use that kind of construction. So issue upon issue upon issue from that perspective. Here's what I would personally do in order to fix this situation, because we can't just use our conclave influence for getting settlements to a higher tier. Well, first off, it should probably be a case that we don't have to spend influence to get settlements when we're capturing them at higher tier provincial capitals. Maybe we can spend materials on that subject, but a lower amount than we would if we were, just constructing things normally. And maybe provincial capitals should not cost materials in the first place, or a reduced amount. It makes sense to have the material system for your factories. Because remember, you're not just using materials for the sake of, constructing provincial capital buildings. The primary purpose you should be using for materials for is all kinds of factories to produce armaments and to produce money. But when your provincial capitals require so many materials, then you end up in a situation where your entire economy is slowed down and your entire campaign pacing is slowed down because you're having to make those choices. That's one of the reasons I imagine a lot of people don't necessarily like this resource system. I don't think that it's the design of the resource system, it's all the bullshit you have to go through in order to make it work. Like, most people wouldn't necessarily think about, like, oh, let's raise a settlement, get the materials, and rebuild them from scratch, because when you can abuse, you can abuse that. Another issue that gets, so that's one of the issues that gets created. Or literally just recruit a bunch of armies over here of hobgoblins with spears and put them to raid the Zarnagrund province for the sake of laborers and gold. Because it will literally pay for itself. That is the absurdity of a Chaos Dwarf campaign. It's not it can't work, it's that making it work requires a metric ton of bullshit and a metric ton of understanding of these kind of things in order to even reach a similar level of pacing as other races. The problem that gets created over here, fundamentally, is it means less armies, it means a lesser economy in terms of gold, so less armies from that, less variety of unit recruitment. And while your armies do get very strong later on, that in itself is also a balance issue. Because you have a race that is excruciatingly slow very early on unless you're using that bullshit. But then you are dominating the entire campaign map without a care in the world. That is not a good balance situation in a campaign at all. In any campaign. Because it's pushing a game that's already focused on that kind of early game aggression level and focused on getting that kind of bullshit sorted out as quickly as possible much further than it should be. So those are some of the problems with respect to how Creative Assembly ended up handling this situation with respect to Castor. So I think the solution really should lie with provincial capitals. They shouldn't require materials to upgrade, or at the very least, the basic economic building should not require materials. It should just be a question of gold. Because factories will generate more gold, and incidentally, it's cheaper. Like, consider this. A treasure hole in a provincial capital is almost 2,000 materials for 750 gold. If we look at a factory over here, and we see the kind of money it generates, it's 1,200 for 750. Sure, there's materials per turn cost, whereas the provincial capital won't have that. Fair enough, right? But you're always going to have a more limited situation of provincial capitals. It's also a question of, like, limitations on hero capacity, because you can only really increase hero capacity, at least for Bolt Centaurs and Demon Smith Sorcerers. You can only really increase that in provincial capitals. And that's, by the way, another broken thing. You obviously want as many provincial capitals as high level as at least to tier 3, because that is what's going to increase your hero capacity. It's not like, oh, I can just focus on one single provincial capital. No, because you only get one hero capacity per provincial capital for Bull Centaurs and for Demon Smith Sorcerers. It is a better situation with the Infernal Castellans, because if we look at factories in particular, you can increase that hero capacity for Infernal Castellans at tier 3. Though it does kind of feel a bit meaningless to construct this building in a factory, considering that you can't get to the Fire Glaives unless you get it to tier 4, and you are going to want to focus on provincial capitals anyway, and it's just like a waste of a good factory slot from that perspective. So I think it really does boil down to the cost of provincial capitals, the resources we're using in provincial capitals. Because, reminder, we don't just have to spend materials, and it's a lot of materials. We have to also spend laborers to actually get them upgraded to a reasonable level quickly enough in a campaign. And then we have to spend a significant amount of armaments to even be able to produce units from them. Those are the kind of issues that exist in a Chaos Dwarf campaign. And it's actually something that does hurt Zaytan, especially because he is in that kind of dynamic of his campaign where he starts with the tier 1 capital. Now, of course, the AI cheats doesn't give a shit about this, right? Another thing I would say with regards to Chaos Dwarves is that they're too focused on the idea of building shit up and becoming really powerful. Like, they're limited, very limited early on, but once you start getting all these seats, once you start getting, you know, confederations, you're unstoppable. But most other races are unstoppable, but you have to spend dozens and dozens of turns collecting influence, collecting materials, collecting armaments to get to this stage. So I think influence should really just be spent on the Tower of Tsar. It should be spent on the seats in a campaign, and of course, you know, some research. And believe it or not, you'd still have to be careful on how you're spending influence in a campaign situation. From my perspective, maybe we could have an influence situation where we could unlock some of these upgrades with influence as opposed to just armaments. But it shouldn't be like provincial capitals require materials, require you to use influence to get them to a high level, because that creates a bad dynamic that pushes you down either a bullshit path or makes you freaking slow. The power is there, I don't deny it, but there needs to be a more linear path to that power instead of like you're playing this miserable campaign for dozens of turns and then voila, you click the magic button and now you're #1 power in the campaign. And while you do have Chaos Dwarf Caravans, which are really good and worthwhile in terms of engaging and using them, the rewards that these things generate generally don't really feel that worthwhile in quite a few ways. Because remember the cost that we're talking about in regards to buildings. Like 500 armaments to get gold, yeah, I'm not doing that idea. But what about using armaments for labors? Could be worth it somewhat. But then you look at how many materials or labors you can generate for gold. Like, for instance, if I were to send this caravan here, it would be 500 for 500 gold for 166 materials, or 272, but it would take 10 turns. I can obviously go for triple that, but you can kind of start understanding the issues that do start existing in a situation like this in a campaign when you're playing the Chaos Dwarves, and you know, just all kinds of limitations that do happen for the sake of a Chaos Dwarf campaign, right? Because like over here, if I were to send this caravan, it would be 800 because it's also like sale value being calculated, all that, but it's still a fairly long time to get those resources. So I think like Chaos Dwarf caravans need to feel more rewarding, especially if you're sending a caravan down a 10-turn path. So in conclusion, Chaos Dwarves should be more like Total War Troy factions than Total War Pharaoh factions. What do I mean by that, for those of you that haven't played Troy or Pharaoh, or both? Well, in Troy, it was very possible, unless you had a really bad starting position, but it was really possible to access a significant amount of resources and just start using those resources. You would have thousands and thousands, and you would spend them, and it gave you a great deal of choice, consequences for those choices on spending resources. In Pharaoh, they severely limited how many resources you would get from a single settlement, which created a lot of campaign issues. And the way I look at Chaos Dwarves, it's more like Pharaoh than it is like Troy. The systems are the same, but it's somehow the quantity of resources as well, and the limitations on that. So I would prefer an economy of playing as opposed to the constant scarcity that does define Warhammer 3 in general for quite a few races. Though thankfully they have been moving from that kind of system. Like we look at the recent reworks, we look at Khorne, we look at Ogres, we end up having a significant amount of resources to spend and consequences for those resources. So yes, Chaos Dwarves do need a significant campaign balance pass. The systems work, but it's how they work, how they're balanced in a campaign. Because give me 10 more turns in this campaign and I'll just start dominating the campaign map with unlimited armies, basically. Once I get a couple more factories sorted out. Quastine, signing out.